Hi, it's Tash. Welcome to Tash's Library. Today's video is going to be my September wrap-up. It is a little late, but I was on a holiday and I just didn't get around to it. September was Scientific September, so obviously I read a lot of sciencey type books. So I read 7 science fiction books, 2 science non-fiction books, and then I also managed to sneak in 3 fantasy books. All but 3 were physical copies, and then 3 of them were ebooks. So I'm going to go through my Scientific September picks first. So the first prompt was a book with weather on the cover, and for this I picked Ascension by Nicholas Binge. This is a science fiction thriller following physicist Harold Tunmore, who's brought on an expedition to study this 40,000-foot mountain that has emerged in the ocean overnight. The place appears to be quite bleak, very, very cold. It seems to break the laws of physics entirely with regard to time and space, and keeps triggering increasing paranoia amongst the expedition team. Now, this is very hard science with very intriguing ideas, highly atmospheric, very edge on your seat, claustrophobic, and unsettling. It is told in first-person point of view in an epistolary format where Harold is actually writing letters to his niece. He was a very interesting character to sit with. He's very rational, yet open-minded, and this made for a very thought-provoking read. It explored themes such as the fragility of the human psyche, the desire to explore the unknown, human knowledge and its limits, and science versus religion, and survival. And the thing that brought this down for me is I'm not a massive fan of bleak survival stories, and I also found it a bit odd that the sorts of things he was actually writing in these letters, considering they were aimed at his young niece. But I would recommend this if you like science fiction thrillers. Then this is a really fun read, and if you're doing bingo, this would fulfill hard mode for Impossible Places and also hard mode for epistolary. For the prompt technology on the cover, I picked Memories Legion by James S.A. Corey. This is an anthology of short stories that accompany the Expanse series. I have finished the entire Expanse series, and so this was pretty much finalizing it. Has a number of stories. So one of the stories is about the development of the Epstein drive, which is a significant piece of technology in the Expanse. There's also a backstory on Fred, which looks at conscience and regret and atonement. There's another story set on Earth, which studies the character's violent past. Another one is set on Mars, and it follows Bobby's nephew. I love Bobby. She's one of my favorite characters in The Expanse. And her nephew becomes naively involved in Mars's underbelly. There's another one which describes the experience of a group of scientists who are prisoners and have to engage in dog-eat-dog tactics to survive. There's a really cool story called Strange Dogs, which was one of my favorites, and this examines grief and loss in a very, very haunting story about a family struggling to settle on this new planet and with really strange wildlife. In another one, there's a lot of political wheeling and dealing, where a new governor must quickly find his feet on a planet that's unenthused by a change in government, and is also having to deal with his wife's principles as well. And the final story follows a particular character's son who is stuck on a planet following the events of the last book, and he needs to use his understanding of human nature to survive and come to terms with his past. So I really enjoyed the additional context that these stories provide to the characters and to the world of The Expanse. As I said, I really enjoyed the Strange Dogs story. I also enjoyed the stories that continued some of the other characters, so a particular character's violent past and also the political wheeling and dealing one. Really nice to follow, loved characters again, had really great themes, and really the only thing that kind of brought this down a little bit is a couple of the stories are quite dark in tone, and I'm not surprised by that because the Expanse itself became quite dark as well. If you enjoyed The Expanse, then I would highly, highly recommend reading this. And if you're doing fantasy bingo, then this would fulfill hard mode for short stories. For the animals prompt, I picked Bee Speaker by Adrian Tchaikovsky, and this was the third book in the Dogs of War series, set on a post-apocalyptic Earth, a couple hundred years after Bearhead. Now, a call for help is intercepted on Mars, and a group of helpers are actually sent to Earth, and this sort of rescue team is comprised of Ire, who's a reptilian bioform, Wells, a dog form, and Takumo and Ada, who are modified human beings. And once I get to Earth, there's interesting little factions and groups. So there are a number of feudal warlords that are living in bunkers. There's the apiary, which is a religious order that focuses on the worship of bees, the hive mind. And there's the factory that is responsible for creating bioforms. And there's really cool characters from all of these groups. I loved this book. It gave real Canticle for Leibowitz vibes. And in fact, Tchaikovsky does mention that Canticle is an inspiration for this book. And you can just feel it. It juxtaposes that sort of bleak, post-apocalyptic feel with a strong sense of humor. And that's what I loved about Canticle. And it's something that I truly loved about Bee Speaker. It also still manages to explore human nature and the nature of humanity and loyalty, all of these things that are themes in the first two books in the Dogs of War series. It also explores things like altruism versus self-interest. It has a very engaging, fast-moving plot. It does become violent at times. There is quite a lot of violence. But it seems to use this to examine the different ways in which problems can actually be solved and how human beings actually go about solving problems. Very clear character voices and personalities. They are very unique. And Ire, the reptilian bioform, is my all-time favorite. Oh my gosh, so funny. I loved Ire, which is saying a lot because I do not like snakes, and Ire is very snake-like, and this was my favorite character in the book. Bee Speaker is probably my favorite of the series, which I know is a little bit of a hot take, a little bit of an unpopular opinion. I have actually heard the opposite from most people, but I feel like the other two are probably a little bit stronger in some of their ideas, but they're much bleaker, whereas I find Bee Speaker had a really good little bit of humor through it, and it had a bit more cohesive plot happening. I absolutely love this book, and if you are interested in science fiction that explores human nature and what makes someone human, then I would highly recommend this. If you are doing our fantasy bingo, it fulfills the prompt for biopunk, but not hard mode. It is licensed series, but not hard mode, and published in 2025, but obviously not hard mode. For the prompt astronomical term in the title, I picked Revelation Space by Alistair Reynolds. This is a vast space opera set in humanity's far future, told from the perspectives of three characters. We follow archaeologist Dan Salvest, who's investigating a site on the Amarantan planet Resurgam in the Delta Pavonis system, and he's attempting to explain the demise of this particular alien species. We also followed Volyova, who's a munitions expert on a spaceship called the Light Hugger, called that because they are ships that travel just below the speed of light, and she's trying to save her captain from a mysterious blight. And then finally we have Kuri, who is an ex-soldier and now assassin, who is hired to kill a prominent personage in the story. This is a wonderful Reynolds style once again. I can't believe this is his debut novel. It was just, what a feat, what a feat. It is very hard science though, with very interesting explanations of cosmology and space-time and artificial intelligence. So probably not for people who don't want a lot of science info dumps. I enjoyed that because I like science, so that kind of really made the book better for me. but just keep that in mind. It's got very cool alien artifacts, and one in particular is just mind-blowing. There are high stakes, there are politics, horror elements. The aliens are truly alien, which is always cool to read. And it explores themes such as the Fermi paradox, technological progress and its dangers, hubris, and memory. The characters are very unlikable, but they are so fascinating, and they are ultimately the perfect vehicles for examining the key themes and human nature. Now, bear in mind that this is a very slow read initially, and there are parts that seem to be longer than they should be, and I actually think the book was a little bit too long, and it took a bit of time to get used to. But the last few hundred pages I just flew through. But before that, it was a bit slow, and I found myself not really wanting to pick it up. So this kind of brought it down slightly for me. But really, if you love hard science fiction with big ideas, this is a superb book to read. I will definitely be continuing this series. For the prompt pick a wheel, I picked Exhalation by Ted Chiang. This is a collection of short stories, which are very intelligent and thought-provoking. My favorite story in this follows a fabric merchant in ancient Baghdad who learns of a gate through which people can visit their past or future selves. And this just brought such cool ideas with it. There's also a non-human scientist who makes a startling discovery. There's a story about the raising of digital pets, which raises deep ethical and logical issues as well. A gadget proves that free will doesn't exist in one of them, and the ramifications of that. In another one, an inventor creates a mechanical nanny, and we look at the sociological consequences. In another one, people are able to log all their experiences as a form of external eidetic memory, which is really interesting because it looks at the fallibility of memory. And quite a short little story, scientists focus on the search for extraterrestrial life while ignoring life on the planet. So that was interesting. Certainly raises some issues about the focus of study. And finally, there was a story that was a little bit unsettling in my mind, but it looks at how machines are capable of allowing people to speak to their parallel selves in parallel universes and learn the consequences of the choices they didn't make. And this was very, very thought-provoking and probably one of the more interesting stories in this, but as I said, unsettling, a little bit disturbing. So this is highly thought-provoking, very imaginative and emotive thought experiments, which is really what Chiang is great at. He explores themes of consciousness, memory, identity, the consequences of knowledge, the importance of lived experience, choice and self-determination, and determinism versus free will. I enjoyed Chiang's Stories of Your Life and Others a little bit more. I like the variety of the stories more, but this is just so recommended. I still love this book. And if you enjoy science fiction short stories that make you think, go for it. You must read this. And if you're doing our fantasy bingo, it fulfills hard mode for short stories. Looking at my two non-fiction that I read for Scientific September, the first one was for the prompt, a book about chemistry, and I picked Chemistry for Breakfast by Mighty Nguyen Kim. And this is a very easy to read, light-hearted discussion of chemistry where Nguyen Kim explains key chemistry concepts in a very simple manner, interspersed with anecdotes about her day. Topics covered include soap, neurotransmitters, fats, water, body odor, chemical bonds, and preservatives. I really enjoyed the discussion of the scientific method in this and the need for critical thinking when considering media reports of scientific studies, social media, etc. I thought that was a vital reading for pretty much everyone. She also explains chemistry in a very easy to understand way. For example, I loved how she used the analogy of human relationships to explain the different chemical bonds. The book also includes some quirky drawings, but the molecule diagrams I felt weren't particularly helpful. I also wanted a little bit more chemistry in this book. There were too many personal anecdotes, in my opinion. but it does make it very readable to non-scientists. So if you're wanting to learn some basic chemistry in an entertaining manner, I would recommend this book. Then I read Krakatoa by Simon Winchester for the prompt about geology. And it tells the story of the eruption of the Indonesian island of Krakatoa in 1883. It includes initially quite a lot of colonial history of the East Indies and the geographical and economic importance of this area. It tells the story of the discovery of plate tectonics and how they work, and spends a lot of time on individuals' accounts of the eruption, but also explains the science behind the violence of the eruption in a subduction zone. And subduction zones are where plates kind of slip under each other. So, and that's all really well explained. It also looks at the technology behind communication, which enabled the world to find out about the eruption very quickly, things like telegrams. It looks at the flora and fauna of the region and the impact of the eruption, and also the political ramifications of the eruption are mentioned very briefly. I loved the science sections of this book. It is incredibly well researched, really well organized, structured, and a good balance of narrative style with academic depth. For me, I found this a bit too long, however, and it had a lot more history and focus on individuals than I would have liked. I kind of thought it was going to be a book about volcanoes, and there was quite a lot of culture and history, and as I said, personal anecdotes, and I'm not that interested in personal histories, so that was a little bit of less interest to me. But that's not a criticism of the book, because that's actually the type of reader I am. But if you're interested in natural disasters and their social, ecological, and political consequences, then this is a fabulous read. Another science fiction book I read was Roadside Picnic by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky, and I read this to fulfill the Buzzwordathon title prompts. In this book, aliens have come and gone without any direct contact with humanity, which is an interesting take on first contact. And what the aliens have done is they've left areas called zones now that were littered with alien objects and phenomena that defy the laws of physics. And these are incredibly dangerous areas, and therefore they are kind of banned and closed off. However, we follow a character called Red Schuhart, who's a stalker. This is a person who illegally enters the zone to locate and then sell artifacts on the black market. So as I said, a very different approach to Alien Contact. I really enjoyed that. It also had a very classic science fiction feel, but with underlying pessimism. So it felt very, very Russian, which you'd expect from a book initially written in Russian, even though it is actually set in a non-disclosed English-speaking country. It is a very thought-provoking novel, and whilst the main character is very unlikable, that's kind of the point, I think. And in some ways, he's as unfathomable as the zone itself. So if you're a character reader, you might not like this because it's more about the ideas than the characters. It explores themes such as the insignificance of humanity, morality, corruption, and of course, survival. What I just liked about this book, as I said, it was quite bleak in tone. I'm not a massive fan of super bleak books, and so it is a very, very dystopian. So just bear that in mind. And obviously, if, as I said, weak on characterization as well, didn't bother me, but keep that in mind if characters are important to you. I'd recommend this to any lovers of vintage science fiction. It really has that feel to it. And if you're doing bingo, it would fulfill not hard mode, but for impossible places. And then for a Goodreads challenge, I read A Mimicking of Known Successes by Malka Older. And this is a novella in which humanity is living on constructed rings in the atmosphere of Jupiter due to the inhabitability of Earth. Mossa is one of our characters, and she's investigating the disappearance of a scholar which takes into the path of her ex-girlfriend, Blighty, who studies Earth's ecosystems at Valdergeld University. The strength of this novella for me was its clever world building. I loved learning about the platforms around the planet, the weather on Jupiter, and the wonderful mausoleum, which houses a plethora of Earth's species. I thought that was a really cool touch. This is a very fun and quick to read science fiction mystery blend. However, whilst the plot was intriguing, I didn't feel that the novella was long enough to satisfactorily develop the mystery and investigation. Also, the romance is sweet and subtle, but I felt that the pair lacked a little bit of chemistry on the page. I'd really recommend this to those looking for a cozy science fiction short read with a touch of romance. And if you're doing our fantasy bingo, this would fulfill the LGBTQI protagonist prompt, but not hard mode. And then the 3 fantasy books I read, mainly because I just couldn't resist. The first one was Werewolves in the Kitchen, Vampires at the Door. This is by M.A. Knights, and it's in the Trussell and Gout investigation series, and I really enjoyed this. The first one's The Pig in the Derby Hat, and I highly recommend it. They're super fun little novellas. So this continues the adventures of these supernatural investigators, Theophilus and his apprentice Clementine. And in this one, they head to London to find some answers to a particular conundrum. And then they find themselves in the midst of a feud between vampires and werewolves. As I said, I love the series so much. It is filled with lovable characters with distinct personalities, an adorable ghost rabbit called Custard, although he doesn't feature as much in this particular story, and a great integration of mythological creatures. It's a short, cozy read that includes some peril and some mystery. It explores themes of loyalty and conscience, and has a cool little twist in it. Great. My favorite character is probably Mr. Grimwood in this one. Really enjoyed him. There's also a kobold called Klaus, and I cannot wait for the next one. So if you love cozy reads, I would highly recommend this. Then on a whim, I picked up A Fellowship of Bakers and Magic by Jay Penner, just because it looked kind of cute and fluffy, and I felt like something cute and fluffy. And this follows Baker Arletta Starstone, who is invited to compete in a prestigious elf baking competition. This is a very cute fantasy world with a medieval vibe. Just a sweet, cozy, fun read with great supporting characters. For example, her orc neighbors. There's a friendly, cheerful dwarf. There's a grumpy phoenix. It explores themes of friendship, found family, self-discovery, and discrimination, and has really low stakes. I found, however, Arletta, the main character, is a little bit annoying. Her inner voice is a little bit tedious, and she's constantly thinking about her love interest instead of the actual competition, which I found a bit frustrating. There's also insta friendship in this. So it's like your best friends within 1 minute of meeting, that kind of thing, which never strikes me as overly believable. It's very predictable. Like, I totally predicted the plot and where it was going. The characters really fit stereotypes, and the slow burn romance is not really believable. I didn't really feel a spark between the 2 characters, despite the constant rumination about each other. But you know what? It was such a fun read, and I'm definitely going to continue this series because it's just a really nice palate cleanser between heavier books. If you're doing our fantasy bingo, this would also fulfill hard mode for cozy SFF, as long as you haven't read anything by the author before. And the final book I picked up was also on a bit of a whim, and it was The Affair of the Mysterious Letter by Alexis Hall. This is a queer retelling of Sherlock Holmes in a Lovecraftian world, and it's told in epistolary format by Captain John Wyndham, who is a trans male in a very Watson narrative style. The Holmes character is a sorceress called Scheherazade, and they are investigating a blackmail case. I love the world building in this. There's an underwater world, parallel dimensions, mystical creatures, a seedy criminal underbelly, air pirates, just super fun action scenes as well. It's got great references to different literary tropes, and the characters are charming. I loved the juxtaposition of Wyndham's strong, quite uptight morality with Shahrazad's hedonistic approach to life, which brought in a little bit of conflict at times. As I said, fun action scenes as well, and explores themes of morality and freedom. What brought this down slightly for me is the plot was a little bit weak. There was no real investigation or deduction happening. It was literally just a sequence of scenes visiting various suspects who are immediately eliminated from suspicion for spurious reasons. I also found the narrative style became a bit tiresome after a while. It's very verbose, old school prose, mimicking Watson's style in the original Sherlock Holmes stories, and I felt this didn't quite work for this. But if you enjoy retellings, then I would recommend this. It was a really fun read. I really enjoyed it, and I would read something by this author again. And if you're doing bingo, it will fulfill a not hard mode for LGBTQI protagonist, and will definitely fulfill hard mode for epistolary. And that's it. That's what I read in September. It was a good reading month, though I'd say my favorite book of the month was Bee Speaker. I really, really enjoyed that. So anyway, let me know what your favorite book of September was. And until I see you next time, take care.